Welcome, you absolute rad lads and lasses. Today I wanted to take a look at an interview that was posted over a year ago, but I've only been recently made aware of, and it's pretty interesting because the Fallout TV show was originally going to be in Colorado. Okay, I wanted to talk about this because having the Fallout TV show take place in Colorado actually would have been very interesting for a number of reasons that I haven't seen talked about very much, and I wanted to lay out here. I might even go as far to say that I kind of wish that it was in Colorado. Alright, so this article is part of an interview that was done with the production designer, Howard Cummings, talking a little bit how the Fallout TV show kind of came together from a creative and design aspect. I'll read a little bit from the article because it has a few things that I find very interesting, especially when we get to the topic of where the Fallout TV show actually took place and where the creators initially thought it would take place. So in the article, Howard Cummings is talking about how he went about looking to create this Fallout TV show. And he goes on to say, I really got to research it like I was doing a period film. He said, noting that there was a vast network of fans whose YouTube videos he could draw from to collect reference material. I hope I was one of those. Those videos not only provided information, they made Cummings fully aware how much scrutiny his work would be subject to from the video game's devoted followers. I realized, wow, if I do this, every single thing I do will be analyzed. Well, you weren't wrong about that. So let's skip down to the next part, which I find very interesting. Amazingly, the Los Angeles locale that is so central to Fallout, I'm not really sure if that's talking about the series as a whole or the actual first game, Fallout. The latter would make a little bit more sense in this context. Was not the original locale as scripted. According to production designer Howard Cummings, the initial concept was to set the story in Colorado. A location scout changed that, however, providing not only some fantastic environments for Cummings, but inspiration for a whole new setting. Switching to set the show in LA was really a response to finding a beautiful location. That location was an abandoned mining town in Namibia that provided Cummings with sweeping landscapes and decades-old wreckage that could be used to help build a post-apocalyptic world. When they abandoned the town, they also blew up the processing buildings, so that was great for us. There was twisted steel that was over 100 years old, eaten by windstorms and rust. When Cummings looked at the ocean, he had a vision of the Santa Monica Pier placed there, and as soon as that idea came to him, he ran to one of the showrunners to suggest setting the show in LA. And the rest was history, I guess, but I couldn't help but think and wonder, what would be different? How would the Fallout TV show be different if it was set in Colorado? And I really do think there would be a number of benefits had they stuck to their Colorado setting. So let's say they did choose Colorado. Where in Colorado would they be? It's a big state. Of course, Denver is a natural choice. It's the biggest city. It's the capital. That makes a lot of sense. However, there are other interesting large cities. Boulder, Colorado, for instance. You also have really important military installations like the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. But if we just disregard a specific city, and instead we can think of the Rockies, these big, beautiful mountains, and there's also interesting landscapes like the Great Dune Field right next to the Rockies that would have provided really interesting contrast. There are just a lot of options when we're talking about a state like Colorado, when we're talking about what kind of environments and what kind of scenery we could have been able to see that might have been unique so far in our Fallout experience. So when kind of thinking about this though, there is a very important consideration, and that is always, what is the established lore for the area that you want this new TV show, in this instance, but in the future, games take place in. So Fallout New Vegas gives us some information about Colorado and specifically Denver. Denver is the dog city. It is this city that is for whatever reason, overrun by dogs. It has just a ton of dogs in the post-war, and this may be related to some pre-war operation or effort to expand the use of dogs, particularly in policing. So we know that Rex comes from Denver. There is some dialogue that talks about the police there having a good amount of cyber dogs, which is kind of unique among the places that we know about in the Wasteland. We also know that there was this huge tribe in Denver called the Hang Dogs who have a special relationship with dogs. They understand dogs really well, and dogs have even worked themselves into their spiritual and religious systems. So dogs are very central to the tribe. We learned that in the time leading up to the events of Fallout New Vegas, Legate Lanius was out east, specifically in Colorado, conquering tribes, and he was leading the Legion against the Hang Dogs there in the east, trying to overtake them and assimilate them like they have so many other tribal groups. What's interesting about this, though, is that it was actually a very hard campaign for the Legion. Their supply lines weren't built very well, and there weren't really other tribal groups for the Legion to assimilate and bolster their numbers when fighting the Hang Dogs. However, the Legion did prevail against the Hang Dogs. And you know, this isn't a lore video, that is the Rad King special. This is a RadLad video, but I just wanted to lay out the context of what we know from Fallout New Vegas. Caesar also talks about how they were able to conquer most of Colorado, so it seems like, as of the events of Fallout New Vegas, Colorado is largely under Legion control. And that's not even to mention Fallout Tactics and the things that happened during that game. Colorado is kind of the end point of the game. You work yourself all the way from Chicago down through the Midwest, and you end up in Colorado because in the Cheyenne military complex, there is Vault Zero. I guess this also works, leading zeros, whatever. Where we have an AI called the Calculator that ends up being the main antagonist as he's building up these large robotic armies and annihilating almost everything outside of the vault. The game ends with the Midwestern Brotherhood coming in and defeating the Calculator, although there are some different endings depending on your choices, so we don't actually know for sure what the canonical ending for Fallout Tactics would be. However, it's really important to point out that Tactics seems to be in a state of soft canon. We can assume that what we know from the game probably is canon, but Bethesda could at any time completely rewrite large portions of it. But honestly, it's hard to say, and I operate under the thought that we should just treat it as canon, except for where it's directly contradicted by what's come after it. But a very important part of this is that Fallout Tactics takes place well before the events of Fallout New Vegas, around 80 or so years. That's a long time to have things change, and what happened in New Vegas would be the freshest if they were still looking at this post-New Vegas time frame. All of this is to say, if we are looking at a post-New Vegas Colorado, the lore would state that we have things like Vault Zero at the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. The Midwestern Brotherhood would have controlled the area until the Legion came in and ostensibly fought the Midwestern Brotherhood and took over most of Colorado, although that part isn't explicitly stated. But if we're just assuming that the Midwestern Brotherhood held influence or control over Colorado after the events of Tactics up until the Legion show up, that would have to be the logical series of events. That said, the fate of the Legion after Fallout New Vegas would have a really big impact on what Colorado would look like. If the Legion broke apart or fractured because of a loss, either at Hoover Dam or of Caesar, or both, why not both, that could mean that the Legion itself broke up into smaller states warring against each other for power. It could also mean that there is a giant power vacuum and that other different unknown factions could rise up in the meantime and establish themselves. But this isn't a speculation video. What I'm trying to get at here is that Colorado, even Denver, which we have a little more specific lore about, is much more of a cleaner slate than Los Angeles. Los Angeles was a very important location in the first Fallout. It had the most factions in it. It had a lot of things going on, a lot of different groups that show up in later games, the Gunrunners, the Followers of the Apocalypse. That's where we saw most of the Deathclaws for Adam's sake. And of course, we can't forget the Master, who was the reason for a lot of the troubles in that part of the wasteland. Contrast that with Colorado, where the Legion won, but maybe they're there, maybe they're not there, depending on what happened in New Vegas. Maybe there's some old crusty robots from the time when the Midwestern Brotherhood was fighting the Calculator. Maybe there was fighting between the Brotherhood and the Legion. Maybe the Brotherhood had to pull out because in the intervening time, there were issues. But as far as established lore is concerned, in Colorado, we have Vault Zero. We have the Legion controlling all or most of it for a certain period of time. And we have a tribe called the Hangdogs in Denver where there's a lot of dogs. That's it. And because of this reason, a lot of issues that fans had with the TV show in respect to the lore could have been completely sidestepped. One of the first is the location of Shady Sands, which in the first Fallout was kind of near Death Valley. In Fallout 2, it changed a little bit, but in the Fallout TV show, it wasn't even close to those two, and it was apparently all the way down in Los Angeles proper. There was also the criticism of some of these vaults that existed in the LA area not being discovered by the Master. And I think there are ways to justify this. But Vault 4 is a pretty sticky one because its entrance is this giant structure that just juts out of the ground, has a giant vault door, and has the 4 right on it. It would honestly be very, very hard to miss. So those issues would be completely sidestepped because we only know of one vault in Colorado, Vault Zero. We could have put all these vaults in Colorado and it would have never been an issue. Another really big criticism was the destruction of the NCR, or at least the fragmentation of it. It exists in various forms as a smaller entity or multiple smaller entities possibly. However, we wouldn't even have to have this conversation if it was set in Colorado, because the NCR isn't even close to Colorado. And in a similar vein, Shady Sands wouldn't need to move closer to LA to keep it within walking distance of all these characters as they're going on all their quests. It's just not necessary if the TV show is in Colorado. If you just think about some of the criticisms that came out about the TV show, and then think about how they would change, whether they would be the same, reduced, or completely non-existent if the TV show was set in Colorado, I would bet most of them would be completely inconsequential, wouldn't even come up. It wouldn't even be an issue. Now, that's not to say that if it was set in Colorado, that they would have honored all the lore, that they would have played Fallout Tactics, and they would have known about this relatively obscure lore about Denver and the rest of Colorado from Fallout New Vegas. I'm not saying that at all. However, what I am saying is that changes to the lore in Colorado are orders of magnitude less impactful than the changes made in Los Angeles. The setting of the very first Fallout, where some of the most pivotal moments happened, and factions that we have come to know and love grew out and have been seen in other games. In Colorado, if they decided to get rid of Vault Zero, would it have been that impactful? If they decided that the Legion actually wasn't in Colorado, would it have been as bad as blowing up the NCR? If we are being completely honest, the number of fans that would have been upset about changes to a Colorado setting would be far, far less than the number of people that were upset about the changes in LA. And that's because the number of people that have, 1, played Fallout Tactics, and 2, give a shit about the lore can all fit pretty comfortably into a minivan. It honestly just would not have had the same effect if those changes were made in a Colorado setting versus what we got in Los Angeles. Now, what I wanted to bring up was that quote from earlier in the article, namely where the production designer said he was fully aware of how much scrutiny his work would be subject to from the video game's devoted followers. I realized, wow, if I do this, every single thing I do will be analyzed. That makes this change from Colorado, which again, much less lore and much less impactful lore, to LA, where we have a lot of established lore. If he's worried about scrutiny, he should have stayed in Colorado. If he was really worried about what people were going to say and analyze and find all these faults with, he should not have gone to such a lore-dense area as Los Angeles. And it's apparent from this article that this decision was mostly made because of the pretty amazing landscapes that they were able to film at that jived a lot better with the Los Angeles area. You're not getting that in Colorado. So it seems like the production designer saw these, thought how amazing they looked and how well they would do in a Fallout TV show, and from that decided to pivot all the way over, changing the location to Los Angeles. So it looks like the priority was aesthetic over this concern about being scrutinized by all these different fans and ultimately upsetting a subsection of the Fallout fandom. Personally, I liked the TV show. I liked the story. I actually really liked the characters. However, I can't help but feel like if we had gotten a TV show with as much love, with as much care to the presentation, the style, paying attention to the world itself, that we could have gotten a story and a show just as good, but without some of these issues. I'm really curious about what you think. Do you more or less agree with my take? Do you disagree? Do you think LA was the best choice and you have absolutely no problem with where it took place? If it was set in Colorado, what do you think it would have been like? It seems like it would have been harder to have this Hollywood and this Hollywood star subplot and part of the story in the show if it took place in Colorado. Alright, just a few little things here. My wife made this sweater over here that is bedazzled with the Rad King logo. I think it's awesome. So it has replaced my Adam Cats jacket because I love the Adam Cats, but I love that more. You may have also noticed that I have a drill behind me, and that's because I am in the process of working on my house. I was finally able to get a house, and we made sure that it was one that required work because I wanted to put a little bit of myself into it, and that is what we are doing right now. It is taking a lot of time. Someone please send reinforcements. Alright, that's all I got for you guys. Take care. Rad out.